Allaite ton bébé. Rien que le sein, jusqu'à 6 mois. Allaitement exclusif, de 0 à 6 mois.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
À partir du 6e mois, continue de donner ton sein jusqu'à 24 mois et complète-le avec d'autres aliments selon son âge.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the marketplace, we will start the lunchtime plenary session in 1 minute's time. If you're interested in joining, feel free to grab a plate and come and join us for the discussion.
Contient tout ce qu'il lui faut, même l'eau. Yeah. Cela lui permettra de bien grandir et de le protéger contre les maladies. Il est facile à digérer, il est gratuit. Avec le lait maternel, tu ne connaîtras pas l'insécurité alimentaire, ni la malnutrition. Cela permet d'éviter une grossesse rapprochée et de protéger ta santé, maman. L'allaitement crée un lien d'amour vrai et sécurise ton bébé. À ce qu'on dit, les bébés allaités sont plus intelligents, plus gentils et plus robustes. Alors maman, allaite ton bébé. Rien que le sein, jusqu'à 6 mois.
Maman, je préfère ton lait à celui de la vache et à tout autre lait.
Allaitement exclusif, de 0 à 6 mois. À partir du 16e mois, le lait seul ne suffit plus. Complète-le avec d'autres aliments selon son âge. Grand-mère, aide-moi à allaiter ton petit-fils sans lui donner de l'eau jusqu'à 6 mois. La clé du développement durable. Lutter contre la malnutrition, c'est lutter contre la pauvreté. La nutrition.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started with this next plenary now. If you're out in the marketplace grabbing a plate of lunch, feel free to finish queuing up and come into the plenary for what will be a very interesting discussion. I'd like to introduce MNC Saatchi as well as Weber Shandwick, who will be facilitating this discussion. We have Katie and Brian with us today from these two agencies who are embarking on a project to I guess, determine if we can tell a better nutrition story. So this presentation and this discussion with the audience is all about the power of communication, and to look at ways about redefining how we discuss nutrition and communicate it with policymakers and make it relevant for a range of different audiences. It's about seeing if we can make nutrition the universal important issue which we all know it deserves to be. So in terms of what is going to be presented, this is not a magic bullet sort of presentation. They're not going to come with proposals as to how to communicate nutrition, but more to get your thoughts about a few different concepts and really discuss with you all about how you think nutrition should be communicated as an agenda-setting issue. So without further ado, I will actually first, before handing to Katie and Brian, hand to Anaya from the Zambian Civil Society Alliance for Sun, just to say a few words, and then we'll commence the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edwin. I was really excited when colleagues from MNC Saatchi and Weber Shandwick asked me to just say a few things. About a month ago, or so I think, around, I was privileged to have been a part of a advocacy and communications workshop that was facilitated by colleagues from the two agencies. And as my focus in my organization, I come from civil society in Zambia, and my major area of work is around advocacy and communications. I was particularly excited to have been a part of this workshop. And I'm glad to say that having gone to London and having been a part of this workshop, I wasn't overly disappointed. It was very exciting, very engaging, and learned a lot of lessons from the particular workshop. Now, at the risk of preempting, I believe, some of the presentations that are going to come up, one of the key issues for me, one of the major takeaways from this particular workshop was the issue of communication being very interpersonal. What works in different countries doesn't work in other places. And a very powerful presentation that was given was one where I think certain policymakers or a certain target group somewhere were given the ability to wear, one of these 3D goggles that puts them into a situation and makes them kind of sort of relate to that particular situation. And I felt that was a very, very powerful tool that I think we need to take, that I even took back home myself. At the end of the day, I believe all our work, the bedrock of it comes down to communication. All the data that we require, all the numbers that are being crunched, they have to be disseminated at some point. And we have to be very strategic when we communicate, because that's where we either win or lose it. We could do all the background data in the background, but when we actually present it out to the recipients and beneficiaries, and if we don't do it right, I mean, we risk undoing everything that we in fact have worked hard on. So I think one of the key issues for me that was a major takeaway from that particular workshop was, how do we engage with different stakeholders? I come from the global south as it is, and I'll tell you what, it's not an easy thing engaging with policymakers, and I believe this is true everywhere in the world. So how do we come together, and all of us being having a strong focus on nutrition, how do we resonate some of these key messages that we can bring out and effectively communicate to the right people, so that we can actually begin to see impactful changes and changes in lives of people. So great work that you guys have been doing, and thanks again for having invited us to be a part of that workshop. I think if it's anything like it was, which I believe it will be, it will be a very fantastic session that we'll share. So thanks a lot, guys. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Brian, and I am delighted to be here. So often when we are working on the design of communications projects like this, we always want to get stakeholder opinions, and this is such a fantastic opportunity to hear from you. So thank you, Anaya, for those kind words. The workshop we did was over 2 days, and we have about 45 minutes. So we'll try to bring the same level of enthusiasm to this short time we have with you. We do want this to be very, very interactive, and all of you should have some voting cards. where you can express your level of agreement or disagreement to some questions we're going to pose to you. You should also have an A4-sized worksheet, a little table, and I'll explain at the end what we would like you to do with this. But this is also to register your opinion on what you feel might be necessary by way of communications tools and materials to help us tell a better story. Maybe just to make sure that we're doing this correctly, let me ask a couple questions. Is Italy the most beautiful country in Europe? Agree or disagree? We have a little bit of disagreement. How about this question, going back to the title of the presentation, can we tell a better nutrition story? Unanimous, we love to see that. Oh, wait a minute, you've turned it. Good, thank you. Okay, so an overview of today. We'll give you a little bit of an overview of this initiative, of the project. We've got a few case studies to hopefully show you how taking a fresh approach to communications, and it's what other organizations are doing, what other groups are doing, so we've got to adopt some new, innovative, fresh ways of planning communications programs. All of this, of course, was informed by some research, so we're going to share some headline findings, some top-line findings of the research that we did that helped inform us to start to develop and formulate our recommendations. So we got a good understanding, a good grounding of the communications environment with respect to nutrition. And then fourth, this is where it becomes very interactive and fun. We're going to share with you some early thoughts and a few recommendations on what we think might be useful in terms of developing a new narrative. And a narrative is a phrase that most everyone is using now. It's borrowed from politics. Politicians develop their narrative to sort of convince voters what should be, to align with what they want to achieve in terms of their policy aims. So we have some ideas for a new narrative, a new story that we want to get your reactions to. And finally, allowing some time for questions and answers and hopefully getting some good discussion. So beginning with an overview of this project, we haven't yet fully formed it. There isn't a written plan, but it would be helpful to share with you what we think it is and what we think it isn't. So first of all, it is an effort to align the community around a core narrative. It is not a joined-up, integrated, coalition-led effort. So this isn't a great big campaign where we're going to create a big tent and ask everyone to come in and they must agree to working principles. It is, and importantly, aimed at decision makers and the influencers around them. This isn't about just reaching general public. It's not aimed, although very important, it is not aimed at educating the public about nutrition, the consequences. It's not a behavior change communications effort, although that is very important. We're focused on decision makers, influencers, and importantly, with this big global opportunity, this milestone in July, using Rio as a big moment, although we're going to go beyond too. What we envision is providing some open source, white label content, some creative content that you can use and you can disseminate via your own organization's channels. This is not going to be a branded campaign. We're not going to dictate the structures and the timelines. We hope to provide some guidance on what we think works, especially from that important period from January through July next year. We also really want this to be flexible and adaptable. We want you to use it. We want you to embrace this, and we understand that we need to create a framework that is adaptable, flexible for different country settings and different audience settings. This isn't a very rigid framework where at the center we are commanding and controlling the messaging and what you must say to whom and to when. So we want this to be flexible and adaptable. And finally, importantly, this really is an attempt to say and do things differently. We need to challenge the status quo because other organizations, other issues advocates are doing it. They either have been doing it or are starting to do it. So this community also has to challenge the status quo.
So the reason why Brian and I do our jobs is because we genuinely believe that comms can help move a conversation on and galvanise people behind an issue. And I think what we wanted to do, and we're not going to spend a long time on it, is just share a couple of case studies that came to mind from other campaigns as we've been doing our research on nutrition. And this first one is one that was actually mentioned by Anaya. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is we often talk in the nutrition community about the need for evidence. And evidence is really, really important. But I think one of the things that we know from communications is that evidence on its own often doesn't change minds. And often it's evidence and emotion when it works together that creates change. And I think we wanted to share an example of this that actually was for a decision-maker audience. So the United Nations wanted to talk about Syria and the refugee crisis with decision-makers. And they had lots of evidence, but what they decided at Davos was to use Oculus Rift, which is a head-mounted visual reality device. And they created a film where it was a little 12-year-old girl who took you by the hand and showed you through the Syrian refugee camps. And they had decision makers and influencers coming out of that booth in tears. And as part of that event, they saw pledges towards Syria higher than what they'd anticipated from some countries. And I think it's interesting because for us, we can't lose sight that this audience we want to target, the decision makers, are still people too that act on their heart as well as their heads. And this came across in research. So when we spoke to different countries, particularly in the global south, about why they were supporting nutrition, often it was because of a very personal experience. It was a decision maker that had a mother with an iodine deficiency, or it was a decision maker who'd grown up poor themselves and seen the consequences of poor nutrition. So we sort of think you ignore the emotional side at the peril when it comes to communications. So that's the first case study. We think this is relevant to the way we should be living when we communicate. This has gone to...
Just go back, and we skipped over one. Can you pause the video, please? Pause the video, please, for a second. Thank you. I think all of us were moved a couple of years ago at the horrific rape and murder of the 23-year-old medical student in Delhi, and it really shone a spotlight on gender-based violence. There were mass protests that really helped elevate into the nation's consciousness this issue. But advocates were wondering, how can we sustain this flashpoint? How can we pressure for real policy change? So they devised a campaign, a movement really, to rally people behind this purpose, to make sure that this wasn't just a one-off occasion of support. So, as we do in communications, we love to develop creative content. They did a documentary. I'm going to show just a short video. Play the video, please.
How can an ordinary bus ride home go so horribly wrong?
It's quite clear that when 4 or 5 people settle on one woman and rape her, then they don't see the woman as a person.
Sexual violence is real. Bachchi ka ghar kahan hai? And it does not only happen in the streets, it can happen at home, it can happen just anywhere.
72 hours after that brutal rape of a student in Delhi.
It was a case which could have happened to any normal Delhi girl. Enough is enough. We can't take this victimization anymore.
When you talk about rape, in Hindi they say, Izzat lut gayi. Izzat, it's like you've lost your honor.
She's first raped, then she has to tell the whole story before the policeman, then she has to tell the whole story before the judge. She's raped over and over again in a way.
Crime against women has traditionally received low priority amongst the police and unfortunately in the judiciary as well.
I am searching for answers to so many questions.
जो इतने छोटे छोटे बच्चों के साथ इस तरह की जो घटनाएं हो रही हैं, वो ये हमारी पाशविकता को ही दिखा रहा है कि हम समाज में मानव कहलाने के लायक नहीं।
The same Delhi, same people, but now the cases are more. What does it mean?
प्रॉब्लम बड़ी है। 4005 साल से जो सोसाइटी बनी हुई है वो एक दिन में नहीं बदलने जा रही।
कोई भी बदलाव एक दिन में नहीं आता। It takes time to change.
1947 में जो फ्रीडम मिली थी, सिर्फ मर्दों को नहीं मिली थी, वो औरतों को मिली थी।
What happened to our fight for justice? Did anything change after all those protests in our country?
So one piece of creative content can help galvanize a community behind an effort, behind a purpose. And that's what we want to do with nutrition. A story well told is so powerful, can be so powerful, and it's achieving real policy change, with police forces across the country supporting gender sensitization programs and an anti-rape law being passed.
And then this is the final inspiration case study that we wanted to share. And it's one that my agency worked on about 8 years ago now, and it was the UK's first anti-obesity campaign. And the reason why it's interesting, it was called Change for Life, and you can see some of the pictures there, but the reason why I'm sharing it today is that they had a problem with how obesity was perceived and how urgent an issue it was to address. And what they found is that the problem was that it was a problem of the outside. So it was fat on the outside was about how people looked. It was an aesthetic concern. And actually, that wasn't very urgent to a lot of people, because yes, some people might not feel good, they might not look good, but it wasn't really something that policymakers and people and the public needed to get hold of. So actually, one of the things we found in research is the thing that made people really, really want to take action was when you stopped talking about fat on the outside and it became about fat on the inside. Because when you talk about fat in the arteries, fat around the heart, etc., that's when suddenly people go, wow, we have to act on this. This is really important. And I think the reason why we wanted to share that today is quite a few people mentioned in research that some of the physical problems of undernutrition, stunting as an example, when they're just a physical thing, sometimes it's hard to make people care about it. And I think that for us feels like a really interesting example of where the obesity debate was sort of 10 years ago in the UK. The next thing we wanted to share, and we spend about 8 or 9 minutes going through these, is some audience insights we got from a number of different sources. So as part of the project so far, we've been looking at communications from the existing nutrition community, we've been looking at digital communications, and we've also been conducting interviews with members of some of you sitting here. So there was people from Sun that we spoke to, 1,000 Days, SIF, the Gates Foundation. So we've got a sort of a picture of insights about the difficulties some people in this community find when they're trying to communicate nutrition. And what we want to do is take you through these, and at the end there'll be a chance for you to vote on what type of audience insights you find most resonate with some of the struggles that you have in your communications. And for us, when you're thinking about comms, if you're going to find the right comms and the right role for comms, first of all you have to work out the right problem. So it's really important that we get these audience insights right. And we're going to talk about 3 different types of insights on communications barriers, structural barriers and evidence barriers, but we're going to focus on the former because that's what really our priority is here today. So the first problem we came across was this, that people think they know what nutrition is, but actually they don't. So it's almost stuck in the wrong place in people's heads. So when we say nutrition, they hear hunger. Or when we say nutrition, they think of a particular intervention like just breastfeeding. And actually there is a problem here that people still think it's about not having enough food rather than not having enough nutrients. And what was interesting, as well as a barrier, it feels like an opportunity. So when we were talking to people in the community about what made them care about nutrition in the first place, it was often the moment when they realised enough food wasn't enough. And that was said by people like yourselves actually working in the community, but also decision makers. So there were some insights from SUNGG in Uganda that actually it was the realisation in Uganda that they had enough food, but they didn't necessarily have people having enough nutrients, that was the reason why people started to see this as an urgent thing to act on. The second issue is that sometimes we try and make nutrition mean too many things. And one of the things I've said previously is the first ever meeting I had on nutrition, I went in thinking I understood what the word meant. I left the meeting no longer thinking I understood what the word meant. And I find that one of the things that happens when you talk to the nutrition community is you try and pin down what nutrition is, and someone will say to you, but it's not just that, it's also this. And as a result, it becomes this bigger and bigger word that becomes harder to describe and more intangible. So that's something that we think we need to tackle. And in our minds, one of the problems with the word is it's used to describe the process, so the fact that nutrients enter, leave, and are absorbed by the body. But it's also used as a catch-all phrase for all the interventions. So breastfeeding, deworming, all fit in this word nutrition. So for us, that was one of the issues we found that made it difficult for decision makers to understand what the word meant. This one we've picked up on slightly already, but it's hard to make stunting feel meaningful. And it's easy for people to dismiss it as less urgent because sometimes it's just trapped in the physical. And at its very worst, there was someone we spoke to who said, who cares if kids are shorter? And we think this is a really interesting thing to pick up on, because in our minds, there's a question about, is stunting the thing we try and make people care about? Or is it that stunting is an indicator for what we really care about, and that's what's going on inside? Because it's when a child doesn't get nutrients that their immune system doesn't work, and when their immune system doesn't work, they die. It's when the brain doesn't get the nutrients that the brain can't grow, etc. So stunting's the measurement, not the thing we care about. And this was an interesting one because this came up more when we spoke to people in the global south than it did in the north. And what we found was we talk about how nutrition is a big issue to solve, and there's quite a few interventions. So there's 10 or 13 nutrition-specific interventions, and then you've got the nutrition-sensitive interventions. And there were some influencers who were quite honest and said when nutrition people come in and talk to them, the feeling is it looks like a big to-do list. And when you're given a big to-do list, sometimes it's easier to do nothing because you feel that unless you do it all, you're not going to see change. So it feels that sometimes nutrition can get people in an all or nothing mindset, and it's easier then to do nothing and focus on something else. And then this was another slightly divisive audience insight based on whether you spoke to the global north or the global south. So when you speak to people in the global north, they often say that we really need people to understand why this matters. And when you speak to people in the global south, they say, yes, the why is important. But actually where we really struggle is when we're trying to tell people what they need to do and how to do it. And as an example, we spoke to people who confessed that their countries had set nutrition budgets, but because they didn't quite know what to do with them, those budgets had become a free-for-all for other sectors. So other people could borrow from the nutrition budget because they wasn't quite sure what to do with that budget. So that was a really important thing for people in the global south. Structural barriers. So there was a clear audience insight from both the desk research that we did and the audience insights that one of the problems is that this is a multi-sectoral issue and it involves lots of coordination. And I don't think that is new news to anyone sitting in the room. But what we think was interesting was there were influencers talking about how that can be used as a benefit. So we spoke to one person, for example, in the Prime Minister's office in one country in the global south, and they said this could be an opportunity because actually some of these things you're asking me to do, I'm already doing, I'm just not calling them nutrition. So you could talk to me about adjustments, small adjustments, big gains, and I'll be receptive to that. So there's something about, can we take multi-sectoral and rather than framing it as a problem to overcome, can we make it feel more of an opportunity? And then this was something that was discussed as another structural barrier on lots of the things we're saying are good about nutrition are things that happen in the long term, so GDP, etc. And when you've got a decision maker in power for 4 or 5 years, they struggle to know what they can stand up on a podium and say they've done because of nutrition. So how do we create the building blocks that allow decision makers to give themselves a pat on the back that they've done well within their term? And then this was about the accountability mechanisms for tracking nutrition commitments. And there was a bit of pushback from some members in the nutrition community that there's often a focus on securing commitments from countries. And whilst it was recognised that that's absolutely crucial, it was also recognised that sometimes we get these commitments, but actually because the mechanisms aren't in place, it's easier for them to just be words because we can't track them. So there was a sense that the community want to see a bigger push on making sure it's not just money that's being committed, it's a commitment to accountability as well. And finally, one evidence barrier to talk about. So I think we can all feel here probably that data and gathering data on nutrition is difficult. It's interesting to think about the different ways data feel are a problem. So some people said that there's too much data. And actually the focus is that we're not very good at pulling out the most interesting bits and telling stories about them. Other people said that there's not enough data, and that's the problem. And that there are another group outside of the nutrition community who feel that they don't believe necessarily all the data that we do share. There was a sense that the international community can sometimes inflate figures to make an issue sound bigger. Therefore, some people don't trust those figures are correct. And then there's another thing where, I guess, and this is back to the hearts and minds thing, if you don't believe something is important, you look for ways to discredit evidence rather than believe it. And as an example, you see this happen when we share the fact about child deaths and how undernutrition is the underlying cause of nearly half child deaths. And if you're not close to nutrition and it's not a priority issue, often you say, well, every issue is trying to claim child deaths. I don't know if I believe nutrition counts for that many. So it just shows the need to get people's hearts as well as their minds in order to bring the conversation forward. So what I'd quite like to do is, hopefully that just gives you a quick snapshot of some of those insights. And what I'd like to do is go through the 5 comms barriers, read them out, and I want you to put your hand up no more than twice for the 2 that you think you struggle with most or that you think are the most important things that we need to address. So the first one, people think they know what nutrition is, but often they are mistaken. How many people feel that that is one of the big issues that we need to address? Okay, interesting. That's a fair number of you, I think, that are prioritising that. Great, thank you. The second one, we try and make the word nutrition mean too many things. Okay, lots of consensus there as well. Okay. It's a struggle to make stunting meaningful. That's interesting because that's the first time we've had some red cards. So maybe in the Q&A at the end, let's pick that up. That would be a really interesting conversation to have. It feels too big and complex to address. Okay, thank you. And our communications are often focused on the why, whereas often the biggest appetite for knowledge is around the what and the how. Okay. Interesting, very interesting, thank you. And definitely for some of the people that disagreed with those statements, if in the Q&A we could come back to you, that would be fantastic, thank you.
Also, that represents just a very short piece, a snapshot, a summary of the landscape analysis. There's a longer document, and we're going to find a way to get that to you because I saw some notes being taken. So we'll make sure that we can share that document with you. And Edwin's left conveniently. There he is. We'll find a way to get that to you. So some more voting. How do we take those obstacles and address them? What do we need to do to overcome these barriers? So we already are practiced at the agree and disagree. We've got six concepts here where, based on our experience and our feeling, we think we need to shift from A to B. So there are 6 of these statements, and want to see some more voting going on. I'm going to grab a mic. Okay, number 1. We know that we still need to tell a compelling why story. The burden, the problem is incredibly important, but should we be looking to emphasize more on what to do, how to do it, using best practice, celebrating, showcasing the progress that has been made, and giving people the confidence that if they invest more time, energy, and funds, further progress can be made? So, do you agree or disagree that we need to shift from being problem-focused to solution-focused? Cool, thank you. Next. Nutrition, a definition of nutrition might be that it's the right balance of the nutrients that enter the body, are absorbed by the body, and stay in the body. And we're also very much concerned with the other enabling factors that surround that, so that there is a supportive environment to make sure that that good nutrition can happen. As much progress is possible for as many people, but the definition seems to be really complex, and you all agreed with that earlier. Do you agree or disagree that we should move from that complex nutrition definition to something that is simpler? Agree or disagree? Couple of disagreements, 6 or 7 disagreements, the rest agree. Thank you. Third concept. We found in the research that there seems to be this sort of natural linear thought process, this perception that poor nutrition equals hunger, equals starvation, equals death. We feel that we've got to disrupt that. We need to disrupt that linear way and make it clear that just having enough food is not enough alone. Zero hunger, while an important goal, is important, but it's not our only goal. And we need to extract nutrition and the nutrition story from the hunger story. So, do you agree, disagree that we should be moving from talking about enough food to enough nutrients? Only one. Oh, see, you have to disagree. I knew that. You can't do that. It's either A or B. Yes or no, agree or disagree. But thank you. That's very clever. Okay, next one. We know that nutrients are crucial ingredients for those biological processes that help our body and our brains and our organs develop. Stunting and wasting are indicators, but for what really matters, and what really matters is what happens inside the body. So, sort of based on, similar to the case study Katie talked about on the Change for Life, do you think that we should be moving from talking about that outside story of stunting and wasting and the physical impacts that one can see to leading with the inside story? It's about what happens inside that really matters. Agree or disagree? Okay, just 4, 5, 6 disagreements, the rest agree. Next one, a lot of you agreed with this earlier. We have to make it clear that you don't have to do everything to achieve some change. That small additive changes can actually result in big gains. So rather than talking about this comprehensive, complex, long to-do list that everyone must do, can we look at bringing more focus, being prioritized, and having a shorter, manageable action list? Should we be doing that instead of talking about the big to-do list? Just 2 or 3 disagrees and the rest agreed. Thank you. Finally, it feels like in this community, on this issue, more than in other global health and development issues, that you get too technical too quickly. So should we be looking at replacing some of that language, that technical language, that only nutrition specialists and you all in this room and some others understand, with language that is more accessible by the decision makers and those who influence them. And especially thinking about how we can make the language more accessible visually too. How can we tell a visual story with and about nutrition? So, agree, disagree, we want to move from jargon to accessible language. Unanimous. Fantastic. Good. Great. Okay. Thank you. That was really helpful. great, I think, for us to see some reinforcement of the direction that we're heading. And some differences. And a few differences. So we can explore that during the question and answer session. This next session is about the that narrative, that story that we've been talking about. And a good story has building blocks, it has elements. So we'd like to test with you 4 different concepts that could form part of that narrative. Actually, there are 8. There are 4 sets of 2 different concepts. Both of them are very, very valid, but we're going to have a little bit of a debate and a little playoff here. So you either vote for one or the other, and you've got 4 chances to vote for these building blocks of the new narrative. So first, again, both of these ideas are very valid. They're a little bit different in the way that we would address it from a communications perspective. So one is, do we look at preventing deaths, that nutrition is the underlying cause of nearly half of child deaths under 5, and when we tackle nutrition, we save lives?
Or is the focus on unlocking potential and actually the fact that when we give children the right nutrients, we unleash their full brain power, they do better at school, at work? And what we want to know from you guys is, when you're talking to decision makers and your own influencers, what do you find resonates better out of those 2 things? So what would you lead with if you were having those conversations?
So, do you agree with me that it's about preventing deaths, that resonates more with your audiences, the ones you engage with? This is just an agree, no disagree. You either just hold up agree for this one or agree for Katie's. Apologies, I wasn't clear on the instructions. So, half the room agree. Or
unlock potential, would you lead with that?
Okay, majority I think agreeing with that.
Quite split though, that one, yeah.
Yep. Second concept. One is that a child needs nutrients. A child benefits from that right balance of nutrients in order to power their brain and their body. That's one way that we could talk about nutrition and defining nutrition. Or
do we talk less about nutrients and do we talk more about nutrition as the system? And what do you find easier when you're talking to decision makers and influencers? Is it easier to talk about nutrients that children need, or is it easier to talk about nutrition as a system? Do you find one resonates better or is easier?
So just hold up agree for these. If you agree, it's better, it's more resonant to talk about a child needing nutrients to power their brain and body. Say agree or hold up your hand. Thank you. And a couple of disagrees. Or
is it about nutrition as a system, and that's the easier thing to help people get their head rounds? Okay.
You are only voting once on these, right? I see a couple of double voting. Okay. All right, that seemed pretty evenly mixed. The third concept, what could form an important part of the narrative, is whether we talk about the change that happens, the progress that is happening at the individual level, in the household, affecting the family. When a child's well-nourished, they're more able to fulfill their potential, make a greater contribution to lifting themselves and their family out of poverty. Or
do you find when you talk to decision makers, it's more helpful to talk about that change at the country level rather than the family level? So it's about the macro, the economic, the GDP.
So please just hold up agree. If you agree, we should be talking about change at the family level, individual level. Smattering of you, few of you. Or talking about change at the country level. Oh, and someone's standing up for emphasis, I'm guessing. Okay. Good, thanks. Okay, and the final concept. We found this one really interesting and having a lot of discussions around this. Sort of the environment that we're talking about in terms of when nutrition interventions are the most powerful. Clearly, it's about affecting and improving children's lives. But there is sort of a setting, a context that we can use where we talk about healthy mothers and healthy babies. The biggest gains are to be made when we put that focus of the investments in nutrition on mothers, mothers-to-be, women of childbearing age, and the babies. Or
do you find it helpful when you're talking to decision makers that you narrow it to that 1,000 days? Does that help decision makers feel that it's actionable, they can get their head around it easier? Do you have a sense of which one you prefer when you're talking to your audiences?
So, do you agree that we should be putting it in the context of healthy mothers, healthy babies? Okay, thank you. Or talking about 1,000 days. Oh, and standing up for emphasis. Okay, all right. Good, thank you.
That's great, thank you. What it helps us do there is work out where there's opportunities for both things to be in a narrative versus where we have choices. So there's certain things we've learnt here that we couldn't ignore and have a narrative that everyone can buy into. So that's really useful. Thank you very much.
Super. Okay, now we're going to head into a Q&A session and would like to hear from you. Just to cover off a few points, one is please do fill out this form. So as I said at the beginning, part of this communications effort, this project, involves the creation of some content, of some materials, of some communications tools. Can you please indicate on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is, nah, don't need it, and 10 is, this is very much needed, which of these tools you believe are needed by you as a member of the nutrition community to help achieve meaningful change? So there's a list of various tools, materials, activities. If you can please mark against each of those, I think 11 tools on this scale, and then please pass them to, would you be able to collect them, you and your colleagues? So the women in the red scarves can collect these, and we can also take them too. But would really be helpful to get a sense from you on that. So. Second, from the workshop that we had a few weeks ago, there's a working group that is continuing to advise and provide some counsel and some input on this. Third, we want to draft a communications strategy, and very importantly, to take advantage of that opportunity from January through to July in the summit, but also going beyond. But we see that as a real crucial period. So I guess there are 3 outputs that we're looking at developing from this, potentially. One is the core narrative. How can we land that story? How can we tell that story? What is that story that we need to tell better? Secondly, what are the creative and communications tools and materials that you feel are needed? And then third, a sort of top-line strategy for how we can make this work, something that feels coordinated but not dictated. So those are the outputs, those are the next steps. I think that is it. Again, we'll share with you the landscape analysis, and now we have 12 minutes for Q&A. So can I invite Edwin and Anaya back up on the stage?
Okay, great. So we've got a few remaining moments for questions. Thank you, Brian and Katie, for the thought-provoking presentation. Does anybody want to... Here we go. We've got one question down the front.
Hi, Fokker Wientjes, DSM. For me, it's not coming clear enough maybe, so I would love to give a suggestion that we need to focus more on how to make this aspirational. I think it's extremely important that the topic is not only driven from the technicalities, but you've already earmarked that, but I think we need to put much more emphasis on aspiration. This is something that we really want. This is sexy, this is high on everybody's agenda. I don't hear that coming back enough in your presentation. That would be my real recommendation.
Fantastic, that's well noted. Any more questions from the floor?
Yeah, Francesco Branca, WHO. On the concept of malnutrition, the double burden, meaning the undernutrition and the overweight, non-communicable disease, is an important element. It's very difficult to communicate.
Thank you, Francesco. Any further questions? There you go.
Yes, in my part of the world, visuals are very important. A picture, a photo, an image. can you develop some messages which convey some images, pictures? Because some folks in my village don't read too much, but they are able to see.
Yes, J.B. Cadera with Mars Incorporated. I realize that you're trying to unpack as much as you can, and what I'm about to suggest is to pack more in on the grounds that you've clearly focused on the amount of food and the nutritional value of the food. But we have a saying at Mars that if it's not safe, it's not food. And when you look at the significant safety challenges that we face in the developing countries, where 25% of the food could be contaminated, you could meet the amount and there could be nutritional value, but the value really doesn't make it food. I don't know how you factor that in, but I just wanted to share it with you.
Hi, Carolyn Hart with the Spring Project. I'd like to know your communications responses or ideas around that structural challenge of it's everyone's problem but no one's responsibility.
Hi, I'm Tansile Vlagati from Swaziland. I think we should consider in the messaging, customizing it so that it targets the different levels of our audiences.
Can we pause there, Edwin, and come back to some of those and then do a couple more? Is that possible?
We can do one more round of questions, I think, and then we'll have to break up.
Okay. So, and again, just to go back to that first question about aspiration, I think that's a really important one. And I think where it comes out for us is when we were talking about the difference between this being a prevention story or a potential story, because for us that potential aspiration story is absolutely crucial. So I think that's the really good point. From an image point of view, I think that's, again, very crucial. And one of the things we spoke about and shared some inspiration for in our longer session was examples of communications that have made something invisible visible via a visual language. So I think that's a really important thing and one that we want to pick up on. In terms of the safety question, I have to say that's a sort of new angle which we haven't considered at the moment. So we take that on board and pick it up in discussions because it's a different way of us thinking about some of these issues.
It's part of how we talk about the right balance of nutrients has to also include a food safety issue. That's good.
Yeah. And then to the point on customisation, I think that's absolutely key. And I think it's crucial when we say about what this project is and isn't. We're not trying to give people the same language to use to talk to everyone. It's about ideas and messages that people can interpret and apply to their own audiences, and that's really, really key to us. And then there was the comment about the structural barrier on multi-sectoral. And I think from a comms point of view, there would be something around what we're asking of decision makers. So to what extent is coordination an important part of the commitment that we're asking people to make? But there's also a comms framing around, is it a problem or is it an opportunity? And I think what we thought was interesting in the research is the decision makers and influencers telling us, I think there's more of an opportunity here that people aren't taking advantage when they communicate to us. And they did speak about adjustments, small gains, etc. So I think there's two things we can look at.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions. There was one over here, which I'll go to, one at the back, and one over in the yellow.
Thank you. Michael Krawinkel, Germany, University of Gießen. I'd like to make a short comment on your way of showing us communication strategies. By putting nutrients and food on opposite ends of your definition, you disrupt people from their experience because you focus them on nutrients and not more on food they know and they are used to eat and they like to eat. And therefore, alternatives are rather, if we use such an abstract term like nutrients, or if we try to get them to adopt healthy diets which improve their benefit, which address their immediate benefits and refer to their experiences.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sunu Korean from USAID Bangladesh. I had a question in terms of moving forward, if you've had any thoughts in terms of, from my experience, I feel that people think of nutrition as a woman's issue, particularly for focusing on the first 1,000 days of life. So I wondered, moving forward, if you had any consideration for having it much more male-involved and male-inclusive moving forward as everybody's issue and not just a woman's issue.
Thank you. And final question over here.
Yeah, hi, Liz Buckingham from the U.S. government. A quick thought on this is that I think it's quite smart to do the long-term gains of nutrition, and I think that is quite valuable in terms of how we should message this. But I also know, and you all know, that what is urgent is what gets the resources. So I think it's quite valuable to think about, maybe as a complement, how, even though it might not follow the evidence of nutrition, if we can make it very urgent, I think we can get the resources that we need.
Just a quick comment, Andrea from Save the Children Myanmar. I think one thing that's missing for me here is when we generate evidence in country and write reports, they often end up on somebody's computer or desk. And the need to know how to come things up and to make them accessible to policymakers and to other people that we're really trying to reach is something that is much needed for all of us, I think.
And the final comment or question to Nahas Sangulo.
Thank you. You emphasize too much about decision makers. Should we focus on decision makers exclusively or more on the people to put pressure on their decision makers?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Edwin. Actually, let's start with that question last, because that also sparked a conversation at the workshop. If you still have your voting cards, and we do have an answer to this, by the way, but I would like to see first, do you agree or disagree that we should be focusing primarily most of our efforts on decision makers and those who influence decision makers, or should we be looking at a general public communications engagement strategy? So decision makers, agree or disagree? General public? So around the general public, do you see that as a need to educate and activate the public as a route to pressure decision makers to do the right thing? Or is it public education for the sake of it?
Both. It's not either or. Education is good for many things. We have seen in our part of the world that malnutrition affects mostly babies whose parents are not well educated. That we know. But if we can also use that to empower the public to pressure their decision makers, that's also good.
Okay, as I said at the beginning, and you might have missed this, I'm sorry, the way that we're envisioning this project is very much about what do we need to do to engage the decision makers and those who influence decision makers to secure the financial and the political commitments that we want for greater investment. That might include a way of sort of mobilizing and activating the public to demonstrate support for policymakers, but I just don't think this project in its current scope will allow us to do behavior change communication, social marketing, public education. At least in this scope, that's not the way we're envisioning it. Although very, very important, as you say. Next, another question about generating evidence. Yeah, I think if there are sources of data and evidence that you feel exist in sort of large format and are sitting on shelves collecting dust, that we can create something short and engaging and compelling and develop infographics around it or do something else with it, please do let us know. But that's sort of the vision for this project too, is having some bite-sized pieces of creative content and materials. Long-term gains, yes. we don't want to focus on long-term gains at the exception of not thinking about small wins, small quick wins that are important, and infusing a sense of urgency into this so that they will act, the decision makers will act, is absolutely an imperative with our communications. Women's issues, how can we also include the men? I think it's a very, very valid point, something for us to think about a little bit more. I would balance that with also a need to be a little bit more focused. As we had said, you can expand into this as much as you can, and then it becomes that big to-do list, it becomes that overwhelming problem, it becomes that complex issue. If we can think, maybe it's a matter of segmenting or sequencing, if we can think earlier on what is most crucial for this early period with this communications effort, that might be helpful. And communication strategy, I'm sorry, the German gentleman. Yes, talking about nutrients and healthy diets, that's a great comment. We've been talking about the idea that not all food is created equal. So I think there's something in that we can play with. Thank you for the comment. We're wrapped up. Edwin, do you want to make any closing remarks?
Not really, just to thank you both very much, and a round of applause for our presenters for the conversation today. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I encourage you to ask any more questions during the tea break. Brian and Katie will be sticking around. So from 3:30, they'll just be roaming around near the Sun Movement Secretariat booth. If you want to ask more questions about this particular body of work and your perspectives on communicating nutrition, they'll be very interested to have that discussion with you. So thanks very much for attending. And just a last-minute announcement. The food fortification discussion, which was due to happen here, is now happening in the brown room. So if you were going to stick around here for the food fortification discussion, it's now in the brown breakout room. Thank you very much. No problem. Good. That's great.
Special days. Awa ndi masiku oyambirira chikwi chimodzi moyo womwana. Kuyambira pamene mayi ayima kufikira mwana wobadwayo atakwanitsa zaka ziwiri. Mwana amene sanadye chakudya choyenera nthawi iyi amakhala wopinimbira moyo wake wonse. Izi zimabwezera mbuyo kuthekera kwa mwanayo pa ntchito zosiyanasiyana monga maphunziro, masewera, kagwiridwe ka ntchito zamanja zimene zimabwezeretsa mbuyo kutukuka kwa dziko. Tiyeni tigonjetse fundo lopinimbira, 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 ndati kuthetselatu fundo lopinimbira, ndati kuthetselatu fundo lopinimbira.
Mayi amene akukonzekera kukhala ndi pakati akuyenera kudya zakudya zakasintha-sintha kuti akhale ndi moyo wathanzi komanso mwana odzabadwayo adzakhale wathanzi. Amayi oyembekezera adye zakudya zopatsa thanzi zochokera m'magulu onse asanu ndi limodzi. Azakudya zomwe zimapezeka kudera lawo tsiku ndi tsiku. Zakudya monga izi: gulu la zanyemba, nandolokobwe, gulu la zanyama, ziwala mbewa, gulu la zamafuta, mapeya la mtedza, gulu la zipatso, nthochi, mango, masamba kolowa denje bonongwe gulu la zokhutitsa mbatata achimanga mwana akangobadwa ayamwe mwakatiti kufikira miyezi isanu ndikonjetse udolo binimbira tiyeni tikonjetse udolo binimbira